Section 25 of Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas and Yucatan, Volume 1, by John Lloyd Stephens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. The whole of the next morning I devoted to making inquiries on the subject of the Canal route. More is known of it in the United States than in Nicaragua. I did not find one man who had been to the port of San Juan, or even who knew Mr. Bailey's terminating point on the Lake of Nicaragua. I was obliged to send for my old guide, and after a noonday dinner started for the lake. The town consisted of a large collection of straggling houses without a single object of interest. Though the richest state in the Confederacy in natural gifts, the population is the most miserable. Passing through the suburbs, very soon we entered the woods and rode under a beautiful shade. We met no one. Before reaching the lake, we heard the waves breaking upon the shore like the waves of the sea, and when we emerged from the woods, the view before us was grand. On one side no land was visible. A strong north wind was sweeping over the lake, and its surface was violently agitated. The waves rolled and broke upon the shore with solemn majesty, and opposite, in the center of the lake, were the islands of Isola and Madeira, with giant volcanoes rising as if to scale the heavens. The great volcano of Omotepeque reminded me of Mount Etna, rising like the pride of Sicily from the water's edge, a smooth, unbroken cone, to the height of nearly 6,000 feet. We rode for an hour along the shore, and so near the water that we were wetted by the spray. The bank was all wooded, and in one place, on a little clearing by the side of a stream, was a hut occupied by a mulatto, the view from which princes might envy. Further on we passed some women washing, and at a distance of 1.5 leagues reached the river Las Lajas, according to Mr. Bailey's survey, the terminating point on the lake. A flock of wild fowl were sitting on the water, and long-legged birds with wings outstretched were walking on the shore. I had now examined, as well as circumstances would permit, the canal route from the Pacific to the Lake of Nicaragua. A direction had been given to my investigations by getting on the track of Mr. Bailey's survey, but I should be able to communicate nothing if it were not for Mr. Bailey himself, whom I afterward met at Granada. This gentleman is a half-pay officer in the British Navy. 2 years before, he was employed by the government of Central America to make a survey of this canal route, and he had completed all except the survey of an unimportant part of the river San Juan when the revolution broke out. The states declared their independence of the general government and disclaimed all liability for its debts. Mr. Bailey had given his time and labor, and when I saw him had sent his son to make a last appeal to the shadow of the federal government. But before he reached the capital, this government was utterly annihilated, and Mr. Bailey remains with no reward for his arduous services but the satisfaction of having been a pioneer in a noble work. On my arrival at Granada, he laid before me all his maps and drawings, with liberty to make what use of them I pleased. I passed an entire day in taking notes and memoranda, and receiving explanations, and the result of the whole is as follows. The measurements began on the side of the Pacific Ocean, and were carried over to the Lake of Nicaragua. The chain was 25 varas in length, each vara being 32.5 inches English. The result of the whole is as follows. The length from the Pacific to the Lake of Nicaragua is 28,365 2/3 yards, or 15 2/3 miles. The sum of the ascents is 1,047 feet, 5.45 inches. The The sum of the descents is 919 feet, 2.4 inches. The difference is the height of the lake above the Pacific Ocean at low water, 128 feet, 3.05 inches. We now come to the communication with the Atlantic by means of the Lake of Nicaragua and the River San Juan. The lake is 95 miles long, in its broadest part about 30, and averages, according to Mr. Bailey's soundings, 15 fathoms of water. The length of the river by measurement, with all its windings, from the mouth of the lake to the sea, is 79 miles. There are no cataracts or falls. All the obstructions are from rapids, and it is at all times navigable both up and down for piraguas drawing from 3 to 4 feet of water. From the lake to the river of Los Savalos, about 18 miles, the depth is from 2 to 4 fathoms. Here commence the rapids of Toros, which extend 1 mile, with water from 1½ to 2 fathoms. The river is then clear for 4 miles, with an average depth of from 2 to 4 fathoms. Then come the rapids of the Old Castle, but little more than half a mile in extent, with water from 2 to 4 fathoms. The river is clear again for about 2 miles, with water from 2½ to 5 fathoms, where begin the rapids of Mico and Las Balas, connected and running into each other, and both together not more than a mile, with water from 1 to 3 fathoms. Then the river is clear 1.5 miles to the rapids of Machuca, which extend a mile and are the worst of all, the water being more broken from running over a broken rocky bottom. The river then runs clear and without any obstruction for 10 miles, with water from 2 to 7 fathoms, to the river San Carlos, and then 11 miles, with some islands interspersed, with water from 1 to 6 fathoms, to the river Serapequea, the measurements of 1 fathom being about the points or bends, where there is an accumulation of sand and mud. It then continues 7 miles clear, with water from 2 to 5 fathoms, to the Rio Colorado. The river Colorado runs out of the San Juan in another direction into the Atlantic. The loss to the latter, according to measurement taken in the month of May, 1839, was 28,178 cubic yards of water per minute, and in the month of July of the same year, during the rising of the waters, it was 85,840 yards per minute, which immense body might be saved to the San Juan by damming up the mouth of the river Colorado. From this point there are 13 miles, with soundings of from 3 to 8 fathoms. The bottom is of sand and mud, and there are many small islands and aggregations of sand without trees, very easily cleared away. The last 13 miles might be reduced to 10 by restoring the river to its old channel, which has been filled up by collections at points of drifted matter. An old master of a piragua told Mr. B. that within his memory trees grew half a mile back. The soundings were all taken with the plotting scale when the river was low, and the port of San Juan, though small, Mr. Bailey considers unexceptionable. The foregoing memoranda were placed in the hands of my friend Mr. Horatio Allen, now engaged as engineer on our Croton aqueduct, who has kindly prepared from them the plan opposite. I ought perhaps to remark, for the benefit of those who are not familiar with such plans, that in order to bring the profile of the country within a small compass, the vertical lines, which represent elevations and depressions, are on a scale many times greater than the base lines or horizontal distances. Of the former, the scale is 1,000 feet, and of the latter it is 20 miles to the inch. This, of course, gives a distorted view of the country, but to preserve the relative proportions, it would be necessary for the base line in the plan to be 1,000 times longer. The whole length of the canal from the Lake of Nicaragua to the Pacific is 15 2/3 miles. According to the plan, in the first 8 miles from the lake, but 1 lock is necessary. In the next mile, 64 feet of lockage are required. In the next 3 miles, there are about 2 of deep cutting and 1 of tunnel, and then a descent of 200 feet in 3 miles by lockage to the Pacific. Thus far of the canal across the isthmus. The Lake of Nicaragua is navigable for ships of the largest class down to the mouth of the River San Juan. This river has an average fall of 1 6/7 feet per mile to the Atlantic. If the bed of the river cannot be cleared out, a communication can be made either by lock and dam or by a canal along the bank of the river. The latter would be more expensive, but on account of the heavy floods of the rainy season, it is preferable. I am authorized to state that the physical obstructions of the country present no impediment to the accomplishment of this work. A canal large enough for the passage of boats of the usual size could be made at a trifling expense. A tunnel of the length required is not considered a great work in the United States. According to the plan of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, a tunnel is contemplated upward of 4 miles in length. The sole difficulty is the same which would exist in any route in any other region of country, that is, the great dimensions of the excavation required for a ship canal. The data here given are, of course, insufficient for great accuracy, but I present a rough estimate of the cost of this work, furnished me with the plan. It is predicated upon the usual contract prices in the United States, and I think I am safe in saying that the cheapness of labor in Nicaragua would equalize any advantages and facilities that exist here. The estimate is, from the lake to the east end of the tunnel, from $8 million to $10 million. Descent to the Pacific, $2 million to $3 million. From the lake to the Atlantic by canal along the bank of the river, $10 to $12 million. Total, $20 to $25 million, which is but about the sum contemplated as the cost of our enlarged Erie Canal. The idea of a communication between the Atlantic and Pacific is not new. Columbus wore out the last days of his checkered life in searching for a natural passage, and the vastness and sublimity of the enterprise suited the daring imagination of the early Spaniards. From the formation of the continent and the falling off in height of the range of the Andes, it has ever since engaged the attention of reflecting men. Even during the death-like sleep of Spanish dominion, a survey was made under the direction of the Captain General, but the documents remained buried in the archives of Guatemala until the emancipation of the colonies, when they were procured and published by Mr. Thompson, who visited that country under a commission from the British government. In 1825, an envoy extraordinary from the new Republic of Central America called to it the special attention of our government, requesting our cooperation in preference to that of any other nation, and proposed, by means of a treaty, quotes, effectually to secure its advantages to the two nations. A chargé d'affaires was appointed by our government, who was especially instructed to assure the government of Central America of the deep interest taken by that of the United States in the execution of an undertaking, quotes, so highly calculated to diffuse an extensive influence on the affairs of mankind, and to investigate with the greatest care the facilities offered by the route, and to remit the information to the United States. Unfortunately, being far removed from the capital, none of our diplomatic agents ever visited the spot, but in 1826, as appears by documents accompanying the report of a committee of the House of Representatives on a memorial, quotes, praying the aid of the government of the United States in procuring the construction of a ship channel or navigable canal across the isthmus between North and South America," a contract was made by the government of Central America with the agent of a New York company under the name, style, and designation of the Central American and United States Atlantic and Pacific Canal Company. The names of DeWitt, Clinton, and others of the most distinguished men of that day appear as associates, but the scheme fell through. In 1830, the government of Central America made another contract with a society of the Netherlands, under the special patronage of the King of Holland, who embarked in it a large amount of his private fortune, but owing to the difficulties between Holland and Belgium, and the separation of the two countries, this also fell through. On the 3rd of March, 1835, a resolution passed the Senate of the United States, "that the President be requested to consider the expediency of opening negotiations with the governments of other nations, and particularly with the governments of Central America and Granada, for the purpose of effectually protecting, by suitable treaty stipulations with them, such individuals or companies as may undertake to open a communication between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by the construction of a ship canal across the isthmus which connects North and South America, and of securing forever, by such stipulations, the free and equal right of navigating such canal to all nations, on the payment of such reasonable tolls as may be established to compensate the capitalists who may engage in such undertaking and complete the work." Under this resolution, a special agent was appointed by General Jackson, who was instructed to proceed without delay by the most direct route to Port San Juan, ascend the river San Juan to the Lake of Nicaragua, and thence by the contemplated route of communication by canal or railroad to the Pacific Ocean. After having completed an examination of the route of the canal, he was directed to repair to Guatemala, the capital of that republic, and with the aid of Mr. DeWitt, the charge d'affaires of the United States, procure all such public documents connected with the subject as might be had, and especially copies of all such laws as may have been passed to incorporate companies to carry into effect the undertakings of any convention or conventions that may have been entered into with a foreign power upon the subject, and of any plans, surveys, or estimates in relation to it. From Guatemala he was directed to proceed to Panama and make observations and inquiries relative to the proposed connection of the two oceans at that point. Unfortunately, from the difficulty of procuring a conveyance to the river San Juan, the agent went to Panama first, from adverse circumstances never reached Nicaragua, and died on his return to this country, before he reached Washington. But from his imperfect report, it appears to be the result of his observations that a ship canal was not practicable across the Isthmus of Panama. It is therefore valuable as turning attention, which was before divided between the two routes, exclusively to that by the Lake of Nicaragua. In regard to this route, much has been written. Many speculations and even estimates of the cost of constructing the canal have been made, but the actual knowledge on the subject has been very limited. In fact, the foregoing notes from Mr. Bailey's survey are the most reliable data that have ever been published. I can but hope that the same liberal spirit which prompted the sending out of an agent may induce our government to procure from Mr. Bailey and give to the world the whole of his maps and drawings. As yet, the subject of this communication has not taken any strong hold upon the public mind. It will be discussed, frowned upon, sneered at, and condemned as visionary and impracticable. Many in established businesses will oppose it as deranging the course of their trade. Capitalists will not risk their money in an unsettled and revolutionary country. The pioneers will be denounced and ridiculed, as Clinton was when he staked his political fortunes upon the big ditch that was to connect the Hudson with Lake Erie. But if the peace of Europe be not disturbed, I am persuaded that the time is not far distant when the attention of the whole civilized and mercantile world will be directed toward it, and steamboats will give the first impulse. In less than a year, English mailboats will be steaming to Cuba, Jamaica, and the principal ports of Spanish America, touching once a month at San Juan and Panama. To men of leisure and fortune, jaded with rambling over the ruins of the old world, a new country will be opened. After a journey on the Nile, a day at Petra, and a bath in the Euphrates, English and American travelers will be bitten by mosquitoes on the Lake of Nicaragua, and drink champagne and Burton ale on the desolate shores of San Juan on the Pacific. The random remarks of the traveler for amusement, and the observations of careful and scientific men, will be brought together, a mass of knowledge will be accumulated and made public, and in my opinion the two oceans will be united. In regard to the advantages of this work, I shall not go into any details. I will remark, however, that on one point there exists a great and very general error. In the documents submitted to Congress before referred to, it is stated that, quotes, "the trade of the United States and of Europe with China, Japan, and the Indian archipelago will be facilitated and increased by reason of shortening the distance above 4,000 miles." And in that usually correct work, The Modern Traveler, it is stated that from Europe, quotes, "the distance to India and China would be shortened by more than 10,000 miles." But by measurement on the globe, the distance from Europe to India and China will not be shortened at all. This is so contrary to the general impression that I have some hesitation in making the assertion, but it is a point on which the reader may satisfy himself by referring to the globe. The trade of Europe with India and Canton, then, will not necessarily pass through this channel from any saving of distance, but from conversations with masters of vessels and other practical men, I am induced to believe that by reason of more favorable latitudes for winds and currents, it will be considered preferable to the passage by the Cape of Good Hope. At all events, all the trade of Europe with the western coast of the Pacific and the Polynesian Islands, and all her whale fishing, and all the trade of the United States with the Pacific, without the exception of a single vessel, would pass through it. The amount of saving on which in time, interest of money, navigating expenses, and insurance, by avoiding the stormy passage around Cape Horn, I have no data for calculating. On broad grounds, this work has been well characterized as, quotes, "the mightiest event in favor of the peaceful intercourse of nations which the physical circumstances of the globe present to the enterprise of man." End quote. It will compose the distracted country of Central America, turn the sword which is now drenching it with blood into a pruning hook, remove the prejudices of the inhabitants by bringing them into close connection with people of every nation, furnish them with a motive and a reward for industry, and inspire them with a taste for making money, which, after all, opprobrious as it is sometimes considered, does more to civilize and keep the world at peace than any other influence whatever. A great city will grow up in the heart of the country, with streams issuing from it, fertilizing as they roll into the interior. Her magnificent mountains and valleys, now weeping in desolation and waste, will smile and be glad. The commerce of the world will be changed, the barren region of Tierra del Fuego be forgotten. Patagonia become a land of fable, and Cape Horn live only in the recollection of sailors and insurers. Steamboats will go smoking along the rich coasts of Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Granada, Guatemala, California, our own Oregon territory, and the Russian possessions on the borders of Bering Straits. New markets will be opened for products of agriculture and manufactures, and the intercourse and communion of numerous and immense bodies of the human race will assimilate and improve the character of nations. The whole world is interested in this work. I would not speak of it with sectional or even national feeling, but if Europe is indifferent, it would be glory surpassing the conquest of kingdoms to make this greatest enterprise ever attempted by human force entirely our own work. Nay, more, to make it, as it was once attempted, entirely the work of our city, for it is to furnish a new field for the action of that tremendous power which first brought into being under our own eyes is now changing the face of the whole moral, social, and political world. Is it too much to hope that in honor of services poorly paid but never forgotten, a steamboat bearing the glorious name of Fulton may start from the spot where he made his first experiment and open the great highway of nations to the Pacific Ocean? Thursday, February 27th. At 3 o'clock in the morning we left the yard of the licenciado. The inhabitants of the town were still sleeping. At daylight we passed a village where, before the door of one of the houses, a traveler was making preparation to set out on a journey. We accosted him, and he said he would overtake us on the road. At 8 o'clock we reached a house where we stopped to breakfast. The hospitality of Central America is in the country and in the villages. Here I never knew it to fail. The traveler may stop where he pleases and have house, fire, and water free, paying only for the articles which he consumes. We had milk in abundance, and the charge was 6 cents. Before we resumed our journey, the traveler whom we had passed at the last village arrived, and after he had taken chocolate, we all started together. He was a merchant on his way to Leon, accoutred in the style of the country, with pistols, sword, spatterdashes, and spurs, and, as he was then suffering from fever and ague, wore a heavy woolen poncho, a striped cotton pocket handkerchief around his head, and over it 2 straw hats, one inside of the other. A young man, mounted and armed with a gun, was driving a cargo mule, and 3 mozos with machetes followed on foot. The whole of this region along the coast of the Pacific is called the Tierra Caliente. At 2:30, after a desperately hot and dusty ride, without any water, we reached a hacienda, the name of which I have lost. It was built of poles and plastered with mud. The major domo was a white man in bad health, but very obliging, who lived by selling occasionally a fowl or a few eggs to a traveler, and corn and water for mules. There were no more of those beautiful streams which had given such a charm to my journey in Costa Rica. The earth was parched. Water was a luxury sold for money. There was a well on the hacienda, and I paid 2 cents apiece for our mules to drink. There was a bedstead in the hut. At 4 o'clock I lay down for a few moments' rest, and did not wake till 5 the next morning. On a line with the head of my bed was a long log, squared and hollowed out, with a broad lid on the top, and secured by a lock and key containing the corn and household valuables, and on the top of it were sleeping a woman, rather yellow, and a little girl. I took chocolate, and in a few minutes was in the saddle. Very soon we came in sight of the highlands of Boambacho, a high, dark range of mountains, behind which stood Granada, which in half an hour we entered. Built by those hardy adventurers who conquered America, even yet it is a monument worthy of their fame. The houses are of stone, large and spacious, with balconies to the windows of turned wood and projecting roofs with pendant ornaments of wood curiously carved. I rode to the house of Don Frederico Derbyshire, to whom I had a letter from friends in New York. He had gone to the United States, but his clerk, a young Englishman, offered me the house, gave me a room, and in a few moments my travelling clothes were off and I was in the street. My first visit was to Mr. Bailey, who lived nearly opposite, with an English lady whose husband had died 2 years before, and who, besides carrying on his business, received into her house the few Englishmen or foreigners whom chance brought to that place. My appearance at Granada created surprise, and I was congratulated upon my liberation or escape from prison. News had reached there that I had been arrested, I do not know for what, and was in prison in San Salvador, and as all news has a party bias, it was told as another of the outrages of General Morazan. The house of this lady was a comfort to a battered traveller. I could have remained there a month, but unfortunately I heard news which did not allow me much time for rest. The black clouds which hung over the political horizon had burst, and civil war had broken out anew. The troops of Nicaragua, 1,400 strong, had marched into Honduras and, uniting with those of the latter state, had routed with great slaughter the troops of Morazan stationed at Tegucigalpa. The latter consisted of but 450 men, under the command of General Cabanes, and the records of civil wars among Christian people nowhere present a bloodier page. No quarter was given or asked. After the battle, 14 officers were shot in cold blood, and not a single prisoner lived as a monument of mercy. Cabanes, fighting desperately, escaped. Colonel Galindo, to whom I have before referred as having visited the ruins of Copan, known both in this country and in Europe for his investigation of the antiquities of that country, and to whom I had a letter of introduction from Mr. Forsyth, was murdered. After the battle, in attempting to escape, with 2 dragoons and a servant boy, he passed through an Indian village, was recognized, and they were all murdered with machetes. A disgraceful quarrel ensued between Quejanos and Ferrera, the leaders of the Nicaragua and Honduras troops, for the paltry spoils, and the former got Ferrera into his power and for 24 hours had him under sentence to be shot. Afterward the matter was accommodated, and the Nicaraguans returned to Leon in triumph, with 350 muskets, several stands of colors, and, as a proof of the way in which they had done their work, without a single prisoner. At San Salvador there had been an ominous movement. General Morazan had resigned his office of chief of the state, retained command of the army, and sent his wife and family to Chile. The crisis was at hand. The notes of war sounded fearfully, and it was all important for the prosecution of my ultimate designs, and for my personal safety, to reach Guatemala while yet the road was open. I would have gone on immediately, but felt that I might exert myself too far and break down at an awkward place. In the afternoon, in company with Mr. Bailey and Mr. Wood, I walked down to the lake. At the foot of the street by which we entered, built out into the lake, was an old fort, dismantled and overgrown with bushes and trees, a relic of the daring Spaniards who first drove the Indians from the lake, probably the very fortress that Cordova built, and in its ruins beautifully picturesque. Under the walls, and within the shade of the fort and trees growing near it, the Indian women of Granada were washing. Garments of every color were hanging on the bushes to dry and waving in the wind. Women were wading out with their water jars, passing beyond the breakers to obtain it clear of sand. Men were swimming, and servants were bringing horses and mules to drink, altogether presenting a beautifully animated picture. There were no boats on the water, but about half a dozen piraguas, the largest of which was 40 feet long and drew 3 feet of water, were lying on the shore. End of section 25. End of volume 1 of Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas and Yucatan by John Lloyd Stephens.